Outnumbered starts now.
We begin with breaking news, new developments in the Paul Manafort bank and tax fraud trial. A short time ago, the jury asked the judge, what happens if we cannot come to a consensus on a single count to the entire verdict? What happens? Peter Ducey, live at the federal courthouse in Alexandria, Virginia. I'm reading through the emails that you sent our team. This is a big development. How?
The court just went to a short recess, Harris, so that the Mueller team and the defense could figure out how they want to respond to this question. It is the first question of substance that the jury has had since the first day of deliberations. And this is what it said on a note that came after a knock on the door to Judge Ellis. It said, if we cannot come to a consensus on a single count, what does that mean for the final verdict? Judge Ellis responded. He said this is not exceptional to a jury trial, and he also said the jury can reach a partial verdict. Our team inside the courtroom just ran out and said that the jury has been sent back into the jury room. So the teams thought about it, they responded, and the judge decided that they need to keep going. This question about the final count or about a single count that they can't come to a consensus on is a real evolution in what we've heard from the jury, because the last time that they had a question of substance for Judge Ellis, it was about the fundamentals of the case. Can you please redefine reasonable doubt, and can you please help us organize the government's exhibits, the hundreds of non-sequentially numbered government exhibits? The jury has now been deliberating for about 24 hours, a little bit more than 24 hours over the span of 4 days. And a source close to the Manafort defense said that this morning their side looked at the jury and believed them to be very serious looking, which they took as an indication that there was some kind of a problem possibly in the jury room. Is there anything else, Jake?
He sent them back to continue their deliberations.
Okay, so the jury is going to continue deliberations according to our Justice Department producer, Jake Gibson. We don't know how long they're going to be in there. Here's Jake.
The judge also said that he may instruct them eventually that they could give a partial verdict, but he did not want to tell them that now. He didn't let them know that that's a possibility. Instead, he sent them back to the jury room. He wants those unanimous verdicts. However, he hinted to us that if they can't come to one on a certain count, he may take a partial verdict.
Okay. So you guys heard it from Jake, and that is how we have to get all of our information from the courtroom, because nobody can have any electronics inside. It is literally just reporters go in there with a pen and pad, and they race out to the cameras to get it out as soon as possible. And so you guys heard it at the same time as me.
Yeah, so Peter, I just want to be clear, because we're also getting information back here too. Jake Gibson is emailing out as you are. So it was first reported that this jury was told that a partial verdict could be possible. But what we're saying now is that they actually have not been instructed that. The judge held that back. Is that the case?
It sounds like that is something that he, after they asked, a lot of the time when the judge has something that he wants to communicate to the Mueller team and to the defense, he will do that with the jury outside of the room, with the jury located, sequestered somewhere out. The jury, I'm just getting this also. The judge called the jury about 10 minutes ago. He said, you should not surrender your honest opinion. And the judge also said, each of you must decide this case for yourselves. He also said, you are not partisans. You are judges. You are the exclusive judges to the credibility of the witnesses. And the judge again said, you may disregard my comments as you may disregard anything said in court thus far. So
what is that about?
It sounds like good question. I know that during the before the jury went back to start deliberating after 2.5 weeks of the government laying out evidence and bringing witnesses to make these allegations against Paul Manafort, the judge did say not to take into consideration a lot of the comments that he made to the Mueller team, where he was critical of them focusing too much on Paul Manafort's lavish lifestyle, or of them going too slowly, or of them not making direct eye contact and rolling their eyes. The judge said, don't take any of that into consideration, just focus on the evidence. And it seems like he's just telling them a different version of that right now as they go back, stuck on at least one of the 18 counts.
Very interesting.
But they're going to keep going.
Can I go back just on one other point, because I want to make sure I got it right? You said a source close to the Manafort defense said what exactly?
told me this morning that when they went into court, the jury had a different look. They looked to be more serious than they have looked on the 2.5 weeks of the trial prior to today. And that really did stand in a contrast to their client, Paul Manafort, who spends all day here while he's waiting for a verdict in solitary confinement without a TV or a book or even a magazine, who came into court today and looked as upbeat as he has at any point over the last 2.5 weeks. So you've got the jury, they look like they're serious. You got the defendant who's...
Well, they've been doing this for several days. They're probably serious about ending it.
Well, we'll see. They are stuck on at least one thing. So we don't know if they're going to come back with a partial verdict or if they're going to come back still stuck. And again, it could be a couple hours, it could be a couple more days.
It's so interesting. You and Jake Gibson going back and forth about this idea of partial verdict and where they stand. An 18-count indictment, and as you look at kind of how it's enumerated and broken out, not all of those are necessarily related to each piece of evidence. The prosecution failed to show the connection points. And in their closing arguments, Peter, you've been reporting for us that they had this big chart they wanted to show to kind of connect everything, and the judge said no. And when the jurors came back on that first day, one of their questions was, well, can we get a list of those indictments to try to match things up? It is a lot of information. It can be a very confusing white-collar case. But this news that you've just brought us moments ago from the judge, too, you should not surrender your own opinion, and went on to say that, you know, disregard anything the judge may have said in that courtroom with color. Very, very fascinating. This jury not sequestered, Peter, and that's not unusual, but that seems to be less of a concern compared to what the judge actually said in the courtroom.
Right, but in terms of them not being sequestered, the judge kind of just has to take these jurors' words for it, that they can go home to Northern Virginia somewhere and tell somebody that they just had their 15th day at jury duty and expect that person not to ask them any questions about, hey, are you on the Paul Manafort trial? I just saw this article, or the president just said this about it, or, you know, turning on the TV and seeing something. My point was more that he's cautioning
them against things that he's actually said in the courtroom.
I mean, that goes back to when he said at the beginning about, you know, when he said Paul Manafort obviously isn't great at finances because he didn't notice that his lieutenant was stealing from him there. So
yeah, lots of color from him. Peter Doocy, we'll come back to you as the news warrants. Breaking it today that we have one more question, and it looks like a serious one from the jury, having to do if they cannot reach a consensus on all counts. Thank you very much, and please our best to Jake Gibson along your side there.
Thanks, Harris.
Wow, a lot to chew on here.
Yeah.
And what do you make of it?
You know what? This is the beauty of the American system. It's up to 12 people, men and women, who are sitting there, and they've heard the testimony, and now they're behind the scenes, closed doors, debating things. That's the American system. That's the jury system, and whatever they come up with, that's the verdict.
And we should define what coming to a consensus means. So that means all of the jurors saying guilty, all of the jurors saying not guilty. When Peter talked about the jury being stuck, what that means is they can't come to a conclusion either on not guilty or guilty. And
for all of them.
For all of them, right.
No.
And
for
if
just one of the
single
counts.
count, right.
Or, it was just one of the counts.
No,
they actually just clarified that in our ear
when
just
they
now.
say single, on a single count, what they mean is all of the counts that are laid out, they're looking at, it could be a single count, but it could be multiple single counts that they're deliberating. So it doesn't mean that they're stuck on just one. Right. It means that they could be stuck on multiple single counts, and that's where they are. We just don't know. So it's important to talk about what happens next. If they can't come to a conclusion, they stay stuck, and they say, we can't decide guilty, not guilty. The prosecution then can retry those counts later on if they choose to.
They actually just clarified in my ear that it's only one count. One of the 18 that they're saying they can't come to a conclusion on. But I hear you don't buy that.
On a single count. So that it could be one, but it also could be multiple single counts. They could be deliberating over multiple single counts.
Here's what I would just add to the mix here. The judge, though, according to our producer Jake Gibson, and standing next to Peter Doocy, he's giving him this information, which was very helpful, gave this with the jurors outside the room, this idea of a partial verdict, because he wants them to reach consensus on all of them, on each count, and in total, the 18-count indictment. You know, in oversight, when you were in Congress, you look at a lot of things. And you normally, I would imagine, take everything in its totality. What significance do you think it is, Jason, that the judge would have them outside the room, partial verdict possible, but I still want you all to try to reach a single, one overarching verdict?
Well, it gives the defense and the prosecution time to think about it and contemplate it as attorneys. But I think pushing the jury back in there and saying, no, we're not letting you go. You got to keep going and debating this and hashing out one at a time until you come to this consensus really forces the issue. And people get tired, they get worn out, they've hashed these things time and time again, but that's the beauty of the system. They have to go through it. And I think the prosecution actually created a lot of confusion, too, because they didn't index all this information.
They didn't.
They got thousands of documents that they're supposed to try to sort out.
So that could be a strategy. I mean, that could be, we were talking about this before the show, that maybe the strategy behind it, was it an oversight that they didn't connect all these things and that they didn't use the chart that they had and they didn't draw what went with what? Or was it a strategy that you just get so overwhelmed by how much evidence this is that you decide, by the blob, that you decide that he's guilty? I don't know. I mean, it's interesting. I would also remind people out there, we're talking about tax fraud and we're talking about bank fraud. Bank fraud is when you lie on a loan application. And there were a lot of people during the financial crisis who were guilty of that, who inflated their income on mortgage documents to get a house that they really couldn't afford. And, I mean, it's not, a lot of the charges are very complicated. That's a pretty basic one, and it's one that I think more people in the audience are guilty of than they care to think about.
To your initial point about whether this might have been part of the strategy to throw so much out there that you end up getting confused, that would speak to the fact that basically every prosecutor that I've heard on TV talking about this, we had Andy McCarthy on the couch with us last week, said this is kind of a slam dunk case, pretty open and shut. This is black and white, because this obviously separated from the Mueller probe. We're just talking about tax evasion and bank fraud. So that would make sense there, that they would just try to overwhelm them with documents. We've certainly all seen a document dump of epic proportions in our time.
I actually think that doesn't make any sense at all, because if you're a prosecutor, you do not want any reasonable doubt. If you're going to throw so much evidence at a jury that they get confused, that then creates doubt, and you can't convict someone of being guilty if you have any kind of doubt, reasonable doubt. And so it seems like they were unorganized, maybe they rushed it through, but for federal prosecutors not to label things is pretty out of the ordinary. They're usually very, very organized.
How would you explain why they wouldn't have taken the time to do that when they have it?
They may have stupidly assumed that the jury was able, that they've done enough, they presented enough evidence, the judge was getting irritated, it was taking too long, and therefore they were going to move on. But usually they're a lot more organized.
Can I add one more thought to this, because it is sort of a prosecutorial style, and you can just lay out your case and then wait for that climax at the end to tie it all together. We see TV shows like that, and that's your big payoff in the end. And because people are typically not doing anything else, not working, maybe they're concentrating on each and every element, and then you bring it all together, tie a bow on it, and you look like a big winner at the end. Who knows? Let's bring this in. This is breaking now. Chief Intelligence Correspondent Catherine Herridge is at the federal courthouse in Alexandria, Virginia, as well. And you were just, Catherine, in the courtroom. What are you hearing?
Well, Harris, I'm sitting about 15 feet from the jury, and it began just about an hour ago when the court security officer retrieved a note from the jury room, sort of like what you would rip out of a school notebook, and it was folded in quarters. It went to the judge's chambers. Then he reconvened the court and he read the note, and the jurors said, what happens if we can't reach consensus on a single count? How do we deal with the verdict form, and what does that mean for the verdict overall? There was back and forth between the two sides, and the instructions from the judge to the jury is that they should continue to deliberate. But this was the big moment for me. There was really sort of rapt attention, sort of a laser-like focus of the 12 jurors on the judge, and he said at one point, you must find it within yourselves to respect the view of the minority. And one of the jurors, a man who appears to be in his mid-30s, started nodding very vigorously yes in agreement. So that was a signal to me that he may be the one that's on the outside. But based on the question, they've reached consensus on some charges. They're stuck on one of them. and they're trying to understand how to proceed. The other big takeaway is that the judge did not instruct them that there's the possibility of a hung jury, okay, that there can be division, and that's still okay. So, for example, they reach consensus on 9 of the 18 charges, but they don't reach consensus on the other 9, and that's okay. He hasn't held that out as a possibility at this point. He's urged them to go back and try and reach consensus on this remaining count, Harris.
So that's different, at least in nomenclature, than what we've been reporting. So I want to make sure that we all understand if there is a difference to note here. A partial verdict versus a hung jury. The prosecution could then retry based on the charges that they didn't reach consensus with. Is this judge saying that he would accept a partial verdict then to go forward as a guilty or a non-guilty? What can you parse it for us?
I want to be clear on this. Let's just focus on what the instructions are to the jury right now and not go 2 or 3 steps ahead, which I think is very speculative. What he has said to the jury right now is, I want you to go back, I want you to continue to deliberate and try and reach consensus. What he has not done at this point is sort of offer out other options that would be acceptable to the court. He wants them to focus on consensus. If they come back and they cannot reach consensus, at that point there will be additional instructions. But I don't want to, take it 2 or 3 steps and get too speculative or hypothetical in the discussion of the deliberations.
All right. And as you were talking, we were showing some video of the lead counselor Downing for Paul Manafort, just so if people are looking up at their screen, they're not confused by what they're seeing. The jurors at this point...
Yeah.
Oh, go right ahead.
Could I just do one other thing? One of the things that we're not talking about, and this is my training being inside the courtroom, is that you want to look at the jurors, and then you also want to look at the defendant. And I saw a big shift from Paul Manafort earlier today, where he seemed very, very upbeat. But once the note came in, he became very solemn. He was sort of smiling slightly as he looked forward into the court. And then when the juror's note was placed on the podium so the prosecution and defense could read it, you could see him visibly leaning over to see the handwriting for himself. So very engaged, but also very solemn at this point, trying to interpret, as we all are, what the question means about the 18 counts as a whole, Harris.
Yeah, that's interesting color. It's always complicated when people do so much more tea reading than they do tea drinking. And so what we've had in the last couple of days is, his defense saying and others saying, hey, the longer they stay deliberating, the better it is for the defendant. No doubt he's got some of that in his constellation and is hopeful about it. Another serious note causes you to kind of lean in, as you have said.
Correct.
Catherine Herridge, we will come back to you. We know that you're in and out of the courtroom. It's a wonderful opportunity for us to get some of that color and better information and instruction that the judge is giving. So thank you for being there and for this report.
You're welcome.
Okay, so Jason, again, I lean on your oversight committee experience and your leadership experience, because you've had to take a look at a lot of things where pieces were coming together. Your thoughts on where we are now?
I guess one of the things that bothers me about this just in general is that this has absolutely nothing to do with Donald Trump. It has absolutely nothing to do with Russian collusion. If somebody's guilty, I want him to be convicted. But the reason all the cameras are there, the reason we're talking about this is because for 3 or 4 months of his life, he was engaged in the Trump campaign. And I worry that at some point we have to step back and say, you know what? When you have proximity to people in power, that doesn't necessarily mean you get the full weight of the federal government coming after you on either side of the aisle. Now, again, my understanding of this case is that the federal government looked at it and decided not to prosecute it previously. But because he's now involved in the Trump campaign as the manager for whatever it was, 3 or 4 months, that's why all this focus is going on there. And there'll be all this conjecture about what does this mean for Donald Trump. It has nothing to do with Donald Trump.
Well, I don't know about it. Let me take the other side of that for a second. I mean, first of all, you're not saying that tax evasion's okay.
No,
certainly.
I'm saying if he's guilty, I want him to be convicted.
And also, I mean, if it does show he does have connections to Putin-backed Russians, Kremlin-backed Russians through all of this. I mean, whether they're in Ukraine
well, he was getting money from the former president of Ukraine,
Yanukovych.
who was pro-Russian.
So there is a connection to Russia, and if that did make him vulnerable here, I mean, that's something that we want to see, we want to know. So I understand that these particular charges have nothing to do with the president, but it does unearth the connection, and then you see down the road, did that connection force him to do something later. And we don't know that the president was involved in that. But I wouldn't say that this has nothing to do with Russia at all.
And what you're pointing to, too, and do we even have a date yet on when things will kind of start to cook along? This one's got to wrap up before the one
the second trial
in D.C. happens, the change of venue.
Which Andy McCarthy did
real
point
quickly,
out we might not
you
even
saw
do.
the lead attorney for Paul Manafort, as I said, Counselor Downing, walking in. He said on camera, exiting the court, he does not know if the question about a single count means jurors have a consensus on the 17 other counts with one exception, or on 0 counts and they don't have a consensus on a single one. This is what Counselor Downing is saying, and it's also what Katie Pavlich was saying on the couch as well. We get more clarification. Paul Manafort, we're on verdict watch. Stay close.